On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. This attack has made it clear beyond all doubt that the international communist movement is willing to use armed invasion to conquer independent nations. An act of aggression such as this, it creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. Members of the United Nations have given their support to the action taken by the Security Council to restore peace in Korea.
At the end of the Second World War, the Allies divided the Korean peninsula along the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union controlling the north and the United States controlling the south. Kim Il-sung was installed as a puppet leader by the Soviets. Since the very start of his rule, he was determined to reunify the peninsula. In June 1950, the war began as North Korean troops invaded the south. Motivated by the fear of communist expansion, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution condemning the invasion and calling for member states to assist South Korea. As a result, a multinational force, predominantly led by the United States, but also comprising troops from other UN member countries, was assembled to help South Korea fight back the invasion. Aviation in 1950 was at an interesting crossroads. The war years had fueled a rapid development of new technologies, including the jet engine. The move from piston engine to jet-powered aircraft signalled the end of one era and the start of another. And although coalition forces had been operating the first generation of jet fighters, such as the P-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet, old World War II era aircraft were still very much in operational service. Classic fighters such as the P-51D, renamed in 1948 to the F-51D, featured heavily in the Korean theatre. In the opening months of the war, UN forces enjoyed air superiority, with first-gen jet fighters easily outclassing the LA-7s and Yak-9s of the KPAF. This afforded them a crucial early victory in the air battle of South Korea. Following this early defeat, the Kremlin agreed to supply North Korea with its latest fighter jet, the MiG-15. As part of the deal, Stalin also agreed to train the North Korean pilots. Although the Kremlin denied it, the reality was that the majority of MiG-15s were flown by Soviet pilots, many of whom were hugely experienced World War II veterans. The MiG-15 joined the war on the 1st of November 1950. It was fitted with the Klimov VK-1 jet engine, which was a reverse-engineered copy of the British-developed Rolls-Royce Nene engine with a few minor changes. Now, you may be wondering how Soviet engineers got their hands on what at the time was state-of-the-art British technology. Perhaps it was the result of some daring spy mission or the capture of a downed aircraft. Unfortunately, the real story is a lot less exciting. Looking for a way to stimulate an economy burdened with years of war and hoping to improve relations with its former wartime ally, Britain turned to its world-class aviation industry. And in what would prove a huge blunder, the British government willingly handed over the Nene engine to the Soviet Union. The idea being they could manufacture the engines themselves under license. But rather than pay the license fees, Soviet engineers simply reverse-engineered the Rolls-Royce engines and produced their own copy, the Klimov VK-1. Rolls-Royce did later attempt to recover over £200 million in license fees, but without much success. The MiG-15, with its state-of-the-art jet engine and swept-wing design, enjoyed a significant speed and manoeuvrability advantage over the straight-wing jets of the USAF, especially in transonic flight. The MiG-15, with a veteran Soviet pilot in the cockpit, proved a lethal combination and a growing concern for coalition forces. It soon became clear that something was needed to counter this new threat. Developed in the late 1940s, the North American F-86 Sabre had recently entered service with the United States Air Force. The F-86 was the first American aircraft to incorporate flight data captured from German engineers after the Second World War. With jet engine technology came much higher speeds, and this meant the engineers ran into a problem they had first encountered with the development of powerful fighters from World War II, called compressibility. Aircraft such as the P-38 and P-47 Thunderbolt were susceptible to this, and it was a phenomenon that could prove deadly for pilots. In a dive, these aircraft could begin to approach supersonic speeds. These speeds distort the airflow over the wings and control surfaces, rendering them unresponsive. The wings fluttered violently as they reached their structural limits, further reducing the controllability, making it incredibly difficult to pull out of a dive. It could take thousands of feet in altitude to finally regain control. Pilots who were skilled enough and lucky enough to survive this were often left with a painful souvenir in the form of two huge bruises on the inside of their thighs as the stick had swung violently from left to right between their legs. In the early 1940s, compressibility recovery flaps were fitted to increase drag and reduce speeds in a dive. Where older World War II fighters would only reach these problematic transonic speeds in a dive, the higher speeds encountered by jet-powered aircraft meant compressibility became a much more common problem. Fortunately, the engineers at North American Aviation had access to captured experimental flight data from the Germans. It was during the 1930s that German aerospace engineer Adolf Bussmann had proposed the benefits of a swept wing at transonic speeds, though at the time his work had no practical application, as aircraft of the day were not capable of achieving these speeds. It wasn't until the later stages of the war, during development of jet and rocket-powered aircraft, that engineers noted a swept wing delayed the onset of compressibility as well as reducing drag. This allowed much better controllability at these higher speeds. As the only swept wing fighter in the American inventory at the time, 3 squadrons of F-86 Sabres were rushed to Korea in December 1950 to face the MiG-15. These early variants of the F-86 were outclassed by the MiG-15 in several areas. The MiG was superior in acceleration, surface sealing and rate of climb, although the F-86 could beat it in a dive. But it was the Sabre's AN APG-30 radar gun sight which levelled the field. It was much easier to use than the MiG equivalent and provided the pilot accurate ranging information and computed lead. Although packing less of a punch than the MiG with its 6 50 caliber M3 Browning machine guns, the gun sight meant pilots could land more rounds on target. At that time, the Sabre was the only aircraft that could match up to the Soviet fighter. On December 22nd, in a single dogfight, a flight of F-86s had shot down 6 MiGs with no losses. The MiG no longer enjoyed technical supremacy over the skies of Korea. The Soviets hurried to gather as much intelligence about the North American fighter as they could. They intercepted F-86 radio communications and extensively interviewed captured pilots. This culminated in Stalin himself ordering the capture of a Sabre jet. And the idea the Soviets came up with to achieve this is surely one of the most bizarre plans in military aviation history. The idea was for a flight of MiGs to fly in tight formation around an F-86, boxing it in and then forcing it to fly back to their airbase. With the Sabre still surrounded by MiGs, they would then maneuver to force it to land. This task was assigned to a group of test pilots who were sent to a training base in Manchuria. From there, they practiced flying tight formations, and once ready, they joined the 196th Fighter Air Regiment, part of the 324th Fighter Air Division at Andon. The regiment and its commander, Colonel Yevgeny Popelyav, who would incidentally go on to become one of the Soviet Union's top-scoring fighter races in Korea and even receive the Hero of the Soviet Union, saw the plan for what it was: completely ridiculous, and had no problems telling the test pilots what he thought of them and their mission. On the 31st of May 1951, the test pilots flew their first combat sortie. It did not go well. After failing to achieve any victories, one of the senior pilots was shot down. A few weeks later, their commander crash-landed back at Andon and was killed. The plan was then quietly abandoned, with some of the pilots being sent back to Moscow and others joining combat squadrons. A few months later, on October the 6th, Captain Konstantin Shebestov was flying a combat air patrol in the skies above Korea. Looking down below him, he spotted a single F-86 Sabre trailing thick black smoke. The F-86 was being flown by 2nd Lieutenant Bill N. Garrett, who was attempting to limp his battle-damaged jet to the coastline of the Yellow Sea, where he had the best odds of being rescued after ditching. Keen to seize the opportunity for an easy victory, Captain Shebestov lined up Garrett in his sights and opened fire. Manoeuvring to avoid the incoming attack cost Garrett valuable speed and altitude, and he was forced to ditch in the mudflats along the coastline. He survived the crash landing and was rescued shortly after by a Grumman SA-16 amphibious seaplane. But it wasn't the pilot the Soviets were interested in. Nestled on the coastline, its bare metal fuselage glinting in the sun, was the prize they had been chasing for months. But the Americans were not going to give it up without a fight. What followed in the skies above the crash site was a 3-hour dogfight, with USAF pilots trying desperately to destroy the ditched F-86. Eventually, the rising tide and a setting sun concealed the crashed jet in water and a veil of darkness. The MiGs had managed to fight off the repeated attacks from the Americans, but it came with a high cost. 7 MiGs lost to no Sabres shot down. That night, with information from the MiG pilots, a Russian search team managed to locate the crash site. It was now a race against time. The light from the rising sun would soon betray their position. The Soviets employed 500 Chinese labourers to dig the jet out of the mud. They worked through the night and the following day, having to contend with sporadic fire from the US Navy and the constant threat of aerial attack. Eventually, in the early hours of the following morning, the final pieces of the Sabre were loaded onto a convoy of trucks bound for Andon Air Base. And so began a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with the convoy hiding from USAF patrols in tunnels during the day and only moving under the cover of night. Towards the end of their journey, the convoy suffered a close call as the lead truck decided they could make one more tunnel before daylight. It was a miscalculation, and they were caught out by a B-26, narrowly escaping a rocket attack. Finally, they arrived back at their base. The F-86 was to be kept there for a few days before being sent to Moscow for analysis. The pilots took turns to sit in the cockpit and were impressed with how it was laid out. Colonel Popeliev remarked, "It was like sitting in an expensive car." The captured Sabre was sent to the Air Force Research Flight Test Institute. The Russians could now begin reverse engineering the jet and its systems, potentially saving years of technological development. But after studying the jet, the engineers came to the conclusion that copying its design simply wasn't necessary. The MiG-15 was already a solid match for the F-86, and their newest fighter, just about to go into production, the MiG-17, was much more advanced. However, there was one piece of technology the Sabre carried that the engineers noted gave the American pilots an advantage. This was the AN/APG-30 radar ranging unit. It was able to automatically track targets and calculate their range. The American pilots were well aware of the advantage it gave them. Colonel James Jabara, a Korean War F-86 pilot who became the first jet ace in history during the conflict, noted in his 1960 article, A Fighter Pilot's Airplane, written for Air and Space magazine, that the later acquisition of the radar gun sight in the F-86 was probably the greatest single improvement of the aeroplane during the Korean War. Expert gunners such as Lieutenant Colonel Vermont Garrison and Major Manuel J. Fernandez could hit a MiG at 3,000 feet and high angles off with the radar gun sight. And the shooting problem was also considerably lessened for the more inexperienced pilot. A Soviet engineer, Senior Lieutenant Vadim Maskovich, noted the MiG's inferior gun sight and decided to develop a counter to the AN/APG-30. His solution to the problem was to fit a radar receiver to the back of the MiG-15. When his system detected the radiation from an F-86 radar, it would emit a growling noise into the cockpit, warning the MiG pilot he was in the sights of the enemy. He tested his device by attaching a Sabre radar ranging unit onto the roof of his building. He then ordered MiGs outfitted with his receiver and warning system to fly overhead. As the aircraft flew over the building, the pilots could indeed hear a growling tone that got higher in pitch the closer they got. Having proved the concept, he was ready to test it on frontline aircraft, and in May 1952, he headed to Korea. After arriving at Andon Air Base, Mackiewicz fitted his system to 10 MiG-15s. To begin with, the pilots were dismissive of the idea. They found it had a tendency to frequently give off false warnings, resulting in many of them just turning it off. But that would soon change. Flying over the Yalu River on a patrol, one MiG pilot noticed the system started to emit a faint growl. He looked behind him, but saw nothing. Another false alarm, he thought, and shut the system off. But after a few minutes, he just couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. He turned the system back on to find it was now screaming in a high-pitched growl. He checked his SIGs, and sure enough, behind him were two F-86s closing into gun range. He pulled some hard evasive manoeuvres and managed to evade the attack. There was no doubt about it. Mackiewicz's system had saved his life. As the news of the encounter spread, Soviet pilots began to take the system more seriously, and it proved a crucial tool in increasing the survivability of a MiG pilot in Korea. It was so effective that the technological concept can still be found on Russian aircraft to this day. One of the other advancements that can be attributed to the Russian effort to learn as much as possible about the F-86 was the development and adoption of the G-suit. Worn for the first time by American fighter pilots in Korea, the suit would squeeze the pilot's extremities during high-G maneuvers, keeping the blood from draining away from the head and causing deadly blackouts. Although no MiG-15 pilots wore G-suits during the war, they would go on to become standard equipment.